Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as always, from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA, with part 4, I think, of my episodes on the history of the American West, and this week's episode was supposed to be about the history of the American cowboy. However, the co-host I had lined up, because this is a pretty big topic that I don't want to handle alone, the co-host I had lined up was not available to make it this week. You know who you are. But anyway, she will be here on the 26th of this month, which I know is quite a long shot, but it's the only time we could work out. And since March is Irish Heritage Month, I thought that I would deal with a subject that is deeply rooted with the Irish, and that, of course, is the Transcontinental Railroad. So I thought I would take this chance to discuss the history of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, if you listen to my episode on the history of the American Railroad, you would know that the first American railroad company began in 1827, and it was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which was chartered by Baltimore merchants. And the first American steam locomotive was built by a man named Peter Cooper in 1829 for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. I guess that was the one that raced against the horse and lost. And regular trains began to run in America in the 1830s all around the East Coast. And by the 1840s, the nation's railway networks extended throughout the East, South, and Midwestern United States, and the idea of building a railroad across the nation to the Pacific quickly gained, pardon the pun, steam. And if you remember from the last episode, the history of the California Gold Rush, the first settlers began to move westward across the United States, and this trend increased dramatically after the discovery of gold in California in 1848. And the overland journey across mountains, plains, rivers, and deserts was risky and difficult to say the least. And many westward migrants instead chose to travel by sea, taking the half a year route around Cape Horn at the tip of South America, or they would risk yellow fever and other diseases by crossing the Isthmus of Panama and traveling via ship to San Francisco. And in 1845, a New York businessman named Asa Whitney presented a resolution in Congress proposing the federal funding of a railroad that would stretch to the Pacific. Lobbying efforts over the next several years failed due to the growing sectionalism in Congress. However, the idea did remain a potent one. And in 1860, a young engineer named Theodore Judah said the infamous Donner Pass in Northern California, and yes, that is where a party of westward immigrants had become trapped in 1846 and devised to eat other members of the party. He said this would be an ideal location for constructing a railroad through the rather intimidating Sierra Nevada mountains. The route through the Sierra Nevada mountains had a gradual rise and required the line to cross the summit of only one mountain rather than two. And so Theodore Judah agreed, and he and a storekeeper in Dutch Flat, California by the name of Daniel Strong drew up the letters of incorporation for the Central Pacific Railroad Company. And they began seeking investors, and Judah was able to convince several Sacramento businessmen that a railroad would bring much needed trade to the area, and several men decided to back him. These included a hardware wholesaler by the name of Collis P. Huntington and his partner, Mark Hopkins, dry goods merchant Charles Crocker, and wholesale grocer, soon to be governor of California, Leland Stanford. These backers would later become known as the Big Four. C.P. Huntington and his partners paid Theodore Judah to survey the route. Judah used maps from his survey to bolster his presentation to Congress in October 1861. And many congressmen were suspicious of beginning such an expensive venture, especially with the Civil War happening. However, President Abraham Lincoln, who was a longtime supporter of railroads, agreed with Judah. And on July 1st, 1862, Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act, authorizing land grants and government bonds, which amounted to $32,000 per mile of track, to two companies, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroad. And interestingly, conflict began to arise almost immediately between Theodore Judah and his business partners over the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad. In October 1863, Judah sailed for New York to attempt to find investors that would buy out his Sacramento partners. Though he made the voyage to Panama and across the isthmus by train many times, he contracted yellow fever during this trip and died on November the 2nd, 1 week after reaching New York City. Judah did not live to see the Central Pacific begin work, and he departed for Sacramento for New York a few weeks before the first rail had a spike driven into it on October 26, 1863. Big Four replaced Judah with a man named Samuel Montague, and the Central Pacific construction crews began building the line east from Sacramento. At the eastern edge of the project, a man named Greenville Dodge and his assistant Peter D. surveyed the potential route the Union Pacific would follow. They recommended a line that would follow Platte River along the North Fork that would cross the Continental Divide at South Pass in Wyoming and continue along to Green River. And President Lincoln favored this route and made the decision that the eastern terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad would be Council Bluffs, Iowa, across the Missouri River from Omaha, Nebraska. Thomas C. Durant, a medical doctor turned businessman, gained control of the Union Pacific Railroad Company by buying over $2 million in shares and installing his own man as president. Doc Durant, as he was called, created the Credit Mobile of America, a business front that appeared to be an independent contractor to construct the railroad. However, Credit Mobile was owned by Union Pacific investors, and over the next years it swindled the government out of tens of millions of dollars by charging extortionate fees for work. Because the government paid by the mile of track built, Durant also insisted the original route be unnecessarily lengthened, further lining his pockets. And so, after the completion of the railroad, Durant's corrupt business schemes became a public scandal, with Congress investigating not only Durant, but also several senators and representatives who had benefited from his shady dealings. And the Central Pacific's Big Four formed their corporation with a similar arrangement, awarding the construction and supplies contract to one of their own men, Charlie Crocker, who, for the sake of appearances, resigned from the railroad's board. However, the Big Four owned an interest in Crocker's company, and each of them profited from the contract. And the race between the two companies commenced when the Union Pacific finally began to lay tracks in Omaha, Nebraska, in July 1865. Durant hired Greenville Dodge as chief engineer and General Jack Casement as construction boss. And with tens of thousands of Civil War veterans out of work, hiring for the Union Pacific was very easy. The men were mostly Irishmen, and they worked hard and well, despite going on strike occasionally when Durant withheld the pay over petty labor disputes. And finding workers was a more difficult task for the Central Pacific. Laborers, mainly Irishmen, were hired in New York and Boston and shipped out west at great expense. But many of them abandoned railroad work and were lured by the Nevada silver mines. And in desperation, Crocker tried to hire newly freed African Americans, immigrants from Mexico, and even petitioned Congress to send 5,000 Confederate Civil War prisoners, but to no avail. Frustrated from the lack of manpower needed to build the railroad, Crocker suggested to his work boss, James Stobridge, that they hire Chinese laborers. Although Stobridge was initially against the idea, believing that the Chinese were too slight of frame for the demanding job. He agreed to hire 50 men on a trial basis. After only 1 month, Stobridge grudgingly admitted that the Chinese were conscientious, sober, and hard workers. Within 3 years, 80% of the Central Pacific workforce was made up of Chinese workers, and they proved to be essential to the task of laying the line through the Sierra Nevada. But although they were once believed to be too frail to perform the arduous manual labor required to build the railroad, the Chinese workers accomplished amazing and dangerous feats no other workers would or could do. They blasted tunnels through the solid granite. They often lived in tunnels that they made through their way through the solid granite, saving precious time and energy from entering and exiting the work sites each day. They were routinely lowered down sheer cliff faces in makeshift baskets on ropes, where they drilled holes, filled them with explosives, lit the fuse, and when they were yanked up as fast as possible to avoid the blast. And now this also gives me a chance to discuss some of the men who built the railroads, the Irish and the Chinese. Now, in regards to the Irish immigrants, between 8,000 and 100,000 Irish immigrants made significant contributions to the development of modern America by helping to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, as I said during my first episode of Bowtie Talks about Irish Americans, the potato famine happened during the mid-1840s, rising rent for farmland, and the precarious nature of the linen industry and increasingly dire economic conditions were all factors that prompted the men to leave Ireland. And in America, I can't say they fared much better, because they faced discrimination discrimination due to their religion, language, and lack of work experience. And Irish railroad workers were frequently segregated and housed in cramped railroad cars and were paid less than native-born Americans. It was difficult and tough work. The Union Pacific employed mainly Irish immigrants, as I said, who were unmarried veterans of the Civil War, both Confederate and Union, but mostly Union, as we talked about in my first episode. The work was challenging, and it consisted of digging, grading, and track laying across the Great Plains for long hours at a time through challenging conditions. Style of labor was very military, like with project managers cursing and barking out orders which workers were expected to obey like soldiers. Workers were paid $3 a day with food and lodging provided, which roughly made $35 a month. The men worked from sunup to sundown with only 3 breaks a day for meals, which included large breakfast and lunch portions and smaller dinner portions. They had to endure harsh winter storms, Native American raids on worker camps, and lack of supplies such as firewood made track laying difficult and slow. The Irish workers also suffered dysentery, which was a constant problem because they frequently drank impure water from springs or lakes, and they were expected to lay 2 to 3 miles of track a day. And as I said during my first episode, the Irish immigrants faced much discrimination, and this was when they were still viewed as dirty drunks who were not afraid to go on strike. Even still, though, the railroad companies relied on the Irishmen's labor, and they were valued as hard workers on the railroad and good track layers. And as they approached the meeting of the rails in 1869, the Central Pacific workers were able to lay 10 miles of track a day in a single day with the help of Irish immigrants. And it was a feat and record never seen before, or probably since. After the work of the Transcontinental Railroad was complete, many of the Irish immigrants continued to work for the railroad or found mining jobs throughout the West. And now a word about the Chinese workers on the railroads. The Chinese workers were very punctual, willing, and well behaved. They were sometimes called celestials in reflection of their spiritual beliefs, and they were quite unlike their white counterparts who quickly resented the growing competition and harassed the foreigners. However, foremen made clear to the Irishmen they would work alongside the Chinese crews or be replaced by them, and the Chinese crews were often paid less than the Irish. Chinese teams were organized into groups of 20 under one white foreman. As the difficulty in construction increased, so often did the size of the gangs. Initially, Chinese employees received wages of $27 a month and then $30 a month, minus the cost of food and board. In contrast, the Irishmen were paid $35 a month with board provided, and the Irish and the Chinese were both paid less than the Native American-born people. And it is also interesting to note that the Chinese workers often faced less health ordeals than the Irish workers did. Each Chinese gang of workers had a cook who purchased dried food from the Chinese districts of Sacramento and San Francisco to prepare on site. However, the Irish crews stuck to an unvarying menu of boiled food, beef and potatoes usually, and the Chinese ate vegetables and seafood and kept live pigs and chickens for weekend meals. To the dull palates of the Irishmen, the Chinese menu was a full-blown sensory assault. The newcomers seemed alien in other ways. They bathed themselves, washed their clothes, stayed away from whiskey, and instead of water, they drank lukewarm tea boiled in the mornings and dispensed to them throughout the day. And in such a manner, they avoided the dysentery that ravaged both other crews. And it's easy to see why. By boiling the water, they probably killed off any bacteria that would have been present. And let me tell you, the work itself was definitely not easy. They had to deal with both freezing conditions and, in the farther western states, hot conditions, and I'm sure that many of the men actually faced heat exhaustion and fainted. No endpoint was in sight for the 2 rail lines when President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act in 1862, but a decision had to be made, and fast. By early 1869, the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads were closing in on each other across northern Utah, aided by the Mormon workforce under contract to both companies. But neither side was interested in halting construction, as each company wanted to claim the $32,000 per mile subsidiary from the government. Indeed, at one point, the graders from both companies working ahead of track layers actually passed one another as they were unwilling to concede their territory to their competitors. But nevertheless, construction did end, and on April the 9th, 1869, Congress established the meeting point in an area known as Promontory Summit, north of the Great Salt Lake, and less than 1 month later, on May the 10th, 1869, locomotives from the two railroads met nose to nose to signal the joining of the lines. And at 12:57 p.m. local time, as railroad dignitaries hammered in the ceremonial golden spikes, telegraphers announced the completion of the Pacific Railway. Cannons boomed in San Francisco and Washington. Bells rang and fire whistles shrieked as people celebrated across the country. The nation was indeed united. Manifest destiny was a reality. The 6-month trip to California had been reduced to 2 weeks, and within only a few years, the Transcontinental Railroad turned the frontier wilderness into a habitable place. It was a long, difficult journey that I'm sure was paved with the blood of many, many railroad workers. And I would like to thank the people at lindahall.org and pbs.org for the information I used to make this podcast episode. This is Luke Johnson saying goodbye and God bless.